Welcome to Psych 221, Psychology Applied to Work at North Dakota State University. This is Lecture 1, the course overview, syllabus, and Chapter 1. Let's get going. All right. Course objectives is to teach you an introduction to industrial and organizational psychology, and to provide for you a framework by which you can navigate situations at work from a psychological perspective. The course is structured with video instruction and an accompanied slide deck. So there will be PDFs for each one of the video lectures on Blackboard, and there'll be a link on Blackboard to the playlist on YouTube for all of the lectures. There's a couple bonus lectures that are video only that don't have accompanying slide decks, but that'll be clear. So the course follows this book, which is the 11th edition of a classic. There's no real reason to deviate from the structure of the book. It's nice and comprehensive and in its introductory class, and you don't necessarily need my personal opinion about what proper order should be. So we're just going to follow the class structure. So there's 15, the course structure from the book. So there's 15 lectures, there's 15 chapters, and then there's lectures for each one of those chapters in chronological order. Now, there's additional content that's not in the textbook that I add in the lectures. To an important point for those of you who are watching the video and aren't like skipping the videos and just going for the slides, the test content will be the material that overlaps between the book and the lectures. So there's a good clue there to make it easier for you if you're paying attention. There will be 5 open book tests. There will not be a final. The tests will be timed, and they're open book and open note, but not open friend. And then there will be an opportunity for extra credit. There's lots of extra credit opportunities, and I'll walk through the lectures and tell you which ones are what I call the bonus lectures, which are the extra credit lectures. And then please read the syllabus as well as the details within in the syllabus. If you need assistance, there's still some COVID stuff in there, but make sure at least you are familiar with it, know where it is in Blackboard, and pay very close attention to the dates in terms of the latest day for each one of the tests that you can take them. All right. So who am I and why am I qualified to teach this class? Well, a little glib here, but I have 3 decades of experience at work, and in about 25 years of that is in some form of leadership role. Everything from being a frontline supervisor a long time ago to middle management and senior management, and most of my time as an employee has been in some form of leadership. I have worked at startups. I've co-founded 2 technology startups. I've worked for a small company. I've worked for medium-sized family-owned companies. I currently work for a Fortune 100 company. I'm an advanced engineering manager for a very large multinational equipment and technology company. And I also work for the university in adjunct capacity. And I've worked for nonprofits. Education, kind of eclectic, kind of strange for a psychology class, but I have a bachelor's in electrical engineering. I've got a master's in polymers and coating science. I have a PhD in materials and nanotechnology, and I'm also a PhD student in psychology. All of those are at NDSU, and I'm a North Dakota native and a strong supporter of NDSU. The picture's there. I'm in the kayak there on the right. That's my wife in the far distance on the sunset. That's to the left, the picture there. That's the lake shore in the winter with a fog. That's my daughter in between the pines. All three of my children have attended at one time or another North Dakota State University. My wife and I have been very active with support this sort of the greater NDSU community. My wife is currently the chair of the NDSU Foundation, and teaching this class is a way for me to give back to the institution we care so much about. Okay, let's get into course content. Lecture 1 is on Chapter 1, as is Lecture 2, and then Lecture 3 will be a bonus or an extra credit. So Lectures 1 and 2 are just straight from Chapter 1. So read the chapter and then watch the lecture, or watch the lecture and read the chapter, but do please do both. Most of the structure of this course is predominantly, not in every case, but predominantly 2 lectures that coincide with 1 chapter, and then after that is a bonus lecture. That structure kind of deviates towards the end, that you'll see. Now, Lecture 3 there, a bonus lecture, that means extra credit lecture. That means not from the book. And here, as well as several bonus or extra credit lectures, I'm going to add material that I think is relevant, that is outside of industrial and organizational psychology, that you won't be tested on, but you will be given an opportunity for extra credit. There's a lot of extra credit. Take a look at the syllabus and add up the points, and you'll see that you can definitely move up a full letter grade if you maximize your extra credit opportunity. Each extra credit lecture is worth up to 10 points if you submit a written response, and you'll see in Blackboard the instructions for that. I grade very easily for the first half. To get to 5 points, just submit something that's ethical and meets the requirements and seems to make reasonable sense. But to get the full 10 points for each one of the bonus lectures, you need to really impress me. But most people, get in that 6, 7, 8 points, and considering how many bonus lectures there are, that really adds up. And in the previous semester, a lot of people moved up a full letter grade because of their extra credit. So please keep that in mind, and don't wait for the end, because the extra credit lectures, the opportunity for them expire when the test is due for each section. Okay, so after Chapter 1 and the first bonus, we then go into Chapter 2, and that's the science of IO psychology, and then analysis, which is part of the science. And then we have another bonus called Groups and Complexity. So the first bonus lecture there, Chapter 3, is the human animal in the workplace. That's a fun one. And then Lecture 6, there's Groups and Complexity, also extra credit. Then we're going to get into Chapter 3, and we're going to talk about job analysis and job performance. And then we'll have an extra credit on why we work. And then we'll be done with Chapters 1 through 3, and you'll have your first test. And Test 1 will be multiple choice and timed. There will be due dates, so each one of the tests, all 5 tests, will have a due date, that you can't take the test after that time. But you can take the test early as you want, as long as I make them available. So you can check to see when the test is available, and if you can move as far ahead as you want to, assuming it's available to you. But do keep in mind that's a hard deadline. And the extra credit that coincides with the test. So in this case, test number 1 would be Lectures 3, 6, and 9 are the extra credit. Those expire when the deadline for Test 1 is done. And then we sort of reset for new extra credit opportunities. Okay, so Chapter 4, we're going to get into psychological tests and interviewing for Lectures 10 and 11, covering Chapter 4. Then we'll have a bonus on individual differences at work, which is kind of things like personality at work. And then we'll get into Chapter 5, hiring decisions and finding talent. And then we'll have a related extra credit lecture on retention. And then we'll get into Chapter 6. We'll talk about performance appraisal, both the methods and some of the challenges of it. And then we'll end the Test 2 portion chapters with a bonus called Human Complexity and Performance. And then you have Test 2 covering Chapters 4 through 6. And again, those extra credit expire when the date on the test expires. So in this case, all tests, so each one of the, you'll see this on the syllabus, but each test is worth 200 points, and each extra credit is worth 10 points. So in this case, test 2 is worth 200 points, but you have an opportunity for up to 30 extra points in extra credit. So please keep that in mind. All right, then we get into chapter 7, which we talk about training and development. And then we have a bonus on learning what I call learning the hard stuff at work. And then chapter 8 is about leadership. So what's a leader, what's a follower, what are types of leaders. And we have an extra credit that's relevant to the topic, and that's learning how to lead. Then we get into chapter 9 on motivation and engagement, things like job satisfaction. And we have a final bonus there in this section on becoming more motivated. And then it's test 3, covering chapters 7 and 9. All right, moving right along, we're into chapter 10, where we cover the structure of organizations, the things like organizational charts, hierarchies, networks, that sort of thing. And then we also talk about cultures of organizations, the sort of explicit and implicit rules of an organization, shared values, those sorts of things. And then we have a extra credit. Now this one does not have slides. This is video only. It's an interview with a human resources professional called "What is Human Resources?" Human resources is a field that is highly aligned with industrial and organizational psychology. A lot of the things that come out of industrial and organizational psychology end up in HR departments as part of their tools and methodologies and that sort of thing. And you'll see that crystal clear as we give you the lectures. And anyway, chapter 11 is workplace conditions and workplace challenges. And then notice now we deviate as we're getting into the test 4 and test 5. We don't have as many bonus. It's just the way things worked for how many lectures there's supposed to be in this class. So we're getting right into another chapter, and that is chapter 12, which is safety at work and health at work. And then we have the second bonus lecture, and that is also an interview with another human resources professional, this about what's called strategic human resources. And then we have test 4. So note on test 4, there's only 2 bonus. The previous test 1, 2, and 3, you have an opportunity for up to 30 extra credit points each. But on test 4, it's only 20. Okay, and then the last section is the stuff for test 5. And so that is chapter 13, which is stressors and strain and things that moderate that at the workplace. And then we get into what's called human factors engineering, which is chapter 14. And then we have the only extra credit for the test 5 section, which is an interview with a communications and culture professional. And then we talk about chapter 15, which is consumer psychology and advertisement. And then we have test 5. And test 5 covers the last 3 chapters of the book. Now, as I said, there's only 1 extra credit opportunity. So sometimes you'll find yourself maybe in a hole at the end of the semester wishing your grade was a little bit higher, and you're going to look for extra credit opportunities. Well, the bulk of the extra credit opportunities is in the front end of the class, or at least the first 60% of the class has more extra credit opportunities than the last 40%, and the last 20%, which is the stuff that covers test 5, only has 10 points. So do keep that in mind. Okay, and then when that is done, you're done with the course. But there's also a sort of all chapter review, and lecture 42 is a course recap, where we just cover what we've learned as a way to help with your memory as you move on. I would also suggest to you to after you're done with this video lecture for lecture 1, consider going straight in the YouTube playlist all the way to lecture 42 and get a quick summary of all the material we're going to cover. It's all high level. We don't get into the detail. But it should help you sort of be ready for the kinds of course material and maybe give you a broader perspective of what we're covering in the class. Okay, well that is the syllabus, and so it's time to get into chapter 1. Okay, that is part 1 of the and come back, that's good. If you're well caffeinated or you just got back, we're now going to get into chapter 1, and we're going to address, what is IO psychology. So IO psychology is a subdomain or a domain of the larger science domain of psychology. There's several domains that you're probably at least familiar with. Some of the bigger ones, there's developmental psychology, there's clinical psychology, cognitive psychology, neuroscience, health psychology. I don't have it listed here, but there's engineering psychology. I mean, there's a lot of domains, and the APA has 54 divisions named in psychology. Now, some of those are like a sub of a subdomain. It isn't like there's 54 like broad topics. This is more of a tree structure. Specifically, IO psychology is the 14th named division, and then there is a Society of IO Psychology, the PSYC, and they specifically state that if you're a member of PSYOP and you are a IO psychologist, that means you're a scientist/practitioner, which is to say that you work to advance the field of IO psychology. That would be theory and experiments, but at the same time it's also an applied branch of psychology, and you look to better the world, so to speak, in this case focused towards workplace settings like manufacturing environments, public agencies, really anywhere, retail environments, any work environment. It is an area to apply the science and work out empirically evidence-based sort of interventions that make our organizations better and make our humans flourish within those organizations. So people that work in the field, they might do testing or assessing, they might do leadership development, they work with HR, or they work at HR for staffing. It might be things related to pay, it might be how to get teams to work better, it might be related to safety. There's diversity aspects, there's work-life balance aspects. So really anywhere that psychology might be brought to bear within the organization is an opportunity for IO psychology. The textbook definition calls it the application of methods, facts, and principles of psychology to people at work. And then we'll revisit this many times, but a workplace is a place that you're going to spend a huge chunk of your life at, and you're going to have endless social interactions for good and neutral and not so good, and much more than just testing and assessment and leadership development and management and team performance, and much more than that applies because you're talking about humans interacting with humans. So the great bulk of psychology also applies to the workplace, and we'll be bringing some of the key points into the course. And why does the workplace become an environment where psychology applies? Well, your workplace is more than where you go to get a paycheck. It ends up being also a source of your identity. It's attached to status, self-esteem. I'm not a big fan of the construction of self-esteem. I think the self-esteem movement maybe did more harm than good, but people understand the general concept around self-esteem, and it's group membership. It's in group, and that's also part of identity. There's a lot entangled in all of that, and your emotional states, your motivation, your self narratives are often tied up in work, especially in the West, and maybe more so in America. People, when you run into somebody, you're getting to know them. One of the first things you ask when you're on the get to know you phase is, so what do you do? Whereas in other cultures, it's more like, what village are you from, or who's your family, or what clan are you from, what tribe are you from? But, we kind of put our identity lockstep with what we do for a living, for good and for ill, and so that means there's a lot wrapped up into work that affects us psychologically. Okay, we're gonna look at what is it that IO psychologist does in organizations. What are the problems that they're trying to solve? So these are challenges in the workplace that IO psychology works on, trying to get better at tool sets and processes and information to help these things, such as, how do you hire the right people? You want to do that fairly. You want to do that legally. How do you assess how well somebody is doing in their job? How do you get people to do their job better? There's a lot of money and a lot of difference in success between different organizations. A nonprofit trying to do their best with a volunteer organization, it's still, how do you get the most out of your volunteers? How do you make it a win-win? How do you improve the culture at work? How do you make leaders better? How do you get groups to perform better? How do you make sure the workplace is safe and healthy and that it's a place people want to go to and enjoy themselves? How do you reduce the stress at work? And then on the consumer side, how do you understand the consumer of your product if you're an organization or you're an advertising agency or that sort of thing? How do you improve human-machine interactions? So that should give you a broad overview. It should start to make sense in terms of where IO psychology applies their tools and knowledge. So what is it an IO psychologist then does? Well, they apply these methods and they apply this knowledge to the workplace. That's kind of obvious at this point or redundant. But how do they do that? Well, one of the main ways is observation and inference. So you're in some cases they do field work, like almost anthropologists. Come in and observe people in an actual job and sort of break down the steps and take various lenses through what they observed of overt behavior, which is observable behavior. And then they act as both scientists and practitioners, as I said. So you want to have theory, you want to have experiment, but you also want to have evidence-based interventions. It's probably important to point out here a couple things to what is applied psychology. So this IO psychology is an applied domain. There's obviously a science side of it, but when it's working on actual organizations, it is out in the world, changing things, and that's hopefully for the good. But there was an argument at the dawn of psychology. Somebody named Turcher. The people don't matter, but they matter, but it's not relevant to this discussion here. The point is that people were and are still arguing about the maturity of the domain of psychology in terms of whether findings in the laboratory or theoretical findings that then get published in journals, whether they're really ready for to be interventions in the field. And there's a long history within all the social sciences, but certainly there's a long history within psychology of things being brought out into the world that then people made decisions about that maybe did more harm than good. And so you have to tread lightly and humbly when you're in the applied side of things. So IO psychology has the scientist practitioner model, and in many ways clinical psychology is the other domain that has the scientist and the practitioner model, and where clinical psychology is looking at trying to develop ways to help individuals with their psychological processes and their mental health and those sorts of things. IO psychology is kind of looking at the health of organizations and the effect of the individuals within those organizations. So I mean they have some similarities between them, but when you're doing applied, you want to be cautious and not be too hubristic and thinking that you really understand something, because people are complicated. So one of the things IO psychologists do is research group processes, and sometimes that's in laboratory settings, and when in a lab environment, you can try to reduce all the variables. But if you have people sitting around a table and they're performing a group decision, that won't actually have all the dimensions at play of a similar decision in the workplace. And so it's tough to translate that. So oftentimes IO psychology performs their studies in actual work environments, and that does contaminate things with all sorts of confounding variables, but it's actually where the events are happening. And then one of the big things IO psychology does is work with management, work with human resources, and many people within human resources of large companies are in fact IO psychologists. And so that all the tools and techniques for recruiting, what's the interviewing methods and selection criteria, and what are we doing to retain people and develop people. All of those nuts and bolts of IO psychology, there's nice overlap between what IO psychology has developed and what you would actually encounter for toolkits in the HR department. And so IO psychology sometimes doesn't get the level of respect perhaps by some folks in other psychological domains, but IO psychology has a profound impact in organizations, and it has over 100 years of largely a success story, and many more say wins than losses in my opinion, and many more contributive contributions as opposed to say psychological models that weren't ready and shouldn't have come out into the world. Where clinical psychology is more, I would argue, a mixed bag. And you just need to go back in history of the way we handled mental illness. Google refrigerator mothers and autism, and many other things. And so IO psychology has, in my opinion, done a really good job in terms of what they've applied. And we'll talk about that a little bit in the history of psychology. And it's never perfect, but a lot of the things that were introduced were simply improved upon as opposed to wholesale replaced. So in terms of having credibility as a domain of science and as a subdomain of psychology, IO psychology has been very effective, and it leaves a big footprint, and it continues to, and it's vitally important to the success of organizations. So we'll move on here. It doesn't just work within HR departments. They might work with like communications department. They'll work with labor relations. Work with leadership and management. They might be part of those departments as well. And they look to bring tools. They look to bring frameworks of understanding to try to improve human performance. Try to increase the amount of flourishing that's happening in the workplace. Okay, becoming one. Not all of you, most of you are not likely to become IO psychologists. If this whets your appetite, you think this is interesting, I mean, by all means. I mean, the demand is growing, and it's expected to stay high, and as a good career can be made. Generally speaking, to be an IO psychologist, is expected that you've got some credentials, and it's usually minimally a master's degree, and it's usually a master's degree at a grad school that has a specialty, and minimally at least has an advisor with strong IO psychology background. And in some positions it would require a PhD. These are 2015 numbers, but the median salary for IO psychologists with a master's degree is $85 and $120K for a PhD. So you can make a good living with that kind of income. A lot of the jobs are in business, but there's also government, military. There's consulting companies. There's some consulting companies that just specialize in IO psychology, and then there's larger consulting companies that cover a lot of stuff that include IO psychology, and then of course universities. And then whether you have a direct career, you might be in the HR department and your title might not say IO psychologist, but a solid background in IO psychology can be very helpful for a number of positions. Okay, so current challenges. We're gonna cover some more challenges. So we talked about like what are some of the problems that they look that in organizations they look to solve. But here's kind of why it's hard, and that's because it's a moving target. Change. You've got to keep your research up. One of the major sources of change in our society is technology. It touches everything, and it's accelerating, and it changes our culture. It changes our business processes. It changes our brain structures to some extent. So workplaces are changing. Remote work is growing substantially. The desires and demands of people in the workforce is changing. Demography, there's been across generations. Diversity. It wasn't that long ago where there was major gender imbalance across almost all jobs, and then there were jobs where it was basically completely monoculture, so to speak, where there were typing pools not all that many decades ago of all women, and then there were jobs where there was no women, and right now across most jobs there's a lot of at least gender diversity, and in many places it's 50-50, and then in psychology it's starting to skew the other way in some other fields, and obviously it's not perfectly balanced, but it's changed quite a bit and continues to change. And then in the broader culture is also bringing things to bear in the workplace, and some of it's not so good. We have ongoing culture wars. We've got a lot of challenges with that, polarization, that sort of thing. And then globalization, and now maybe we're in the middle of de-globalization, and then the gig economy. So these are 2018 numbers, but over a third of workers, it was estimated, were participating at least in some way in the gig economy, or in a contingent or a contract role. And companies sometimes like using contingents, or like a temp worker, because it can save them money. And some workers like the gig economy because it can be flexible and independent. But for some people, where they're struggling, the gig economy is all they can get, and they're actually looking for something better. So it's kind of a mixed bag. And then some of the other challenges is growing mental health issues and growing mental health crises in our culture. And so all of these are dynamic things that IO psychology has to address when they're applying their techniques to work. So change is a big deal in terms of challenges, and all of that creates uncertainty. So other challenges. So this is more of what's going on in the workplace as a challenge that IO psychology needs to help with, and that's sort of a mismatch between what, say, an entry-level person thinks they have for skills and what a hiring manager or experienced peers might think. So from surveys where they looked at hiring managers, talked to hiring managers, and then where they talked to new college graduates, what they found, there's a big difference in how the new graduates were assessing their skills versus the hiring manager, and so the big gap in assessing and communication, for instance, so where the new grad thought they had excellent written and oral communication skills, and the hiring manager was like, these people can't read, they can't write. I'm being facetious, but there's a measurable gap between those two assessments. Same thing with thinking, critically and analytically. Same things with the framework people use to make decisions, how they view things from an ethical perspective, how well a new hire's team, how well they work independently, how motivated or not they are, and how they apply the knowledge that they've learned. And so that gap, the gap's an issue. Expectations are a big deal in terms of how well people think they did, and just how do you get people to improve their motivation, improve their communication, improve their critical thinking skills. So there's a lot that IO psychology is trying to bring to bear here for this particular challenge. So some other challenge. This is kind of related to like being an IO psychologist. There's some challenges in the workplace, and one of them is, as I mentioned, it's typically expected that you're going to have a credential, that you're going to have at least a master's degree, and one of the reasons for that is there's also some. Everybody's a psychologist at some level. Okay, there's a thing called folk psychology, which is everybody's sort of working mental model of people. And then you have people that have written best-selling books, and they have like the top 5 ways to motivate people, and they make money going to companies, and they give great speeches, and some of them are, great. Some of the 5 things to motivate people are great, but some of them aren't, and some of them present themselves as though they're credentialed scientists, or they present their work as though this is, legitimate science, and some of it isn't, in terms of peer review and published and that sort of thing. So, a credentialed IO psychologist might look at those people and say those are fraudulent practitioners, and they're contaminating the field. And then that becomes headwinds that you have to, when those people are selling doesn't work, for instance, in an organization, it makes that organization less reluctant to engage myopsychology. But when in fact they really weren't engaging it, they were engaging somebody that was sort of making up their own science. And anyway, that is a challenge in the field. Another challenge is a gap in domain knowledge. So if you're trying to communicate to the management of an organization that you're trying to help, what your technique is and why. You've got to figure out how to translate the jargon. You have to figure out how to cross that knowledge gap difference. And so translation and communication can be challenging. If you're trying to introduce some change in your organization, there's always resistance. Now, human resources, like I said, the IO psychology tools and techniques are the bread and butter of human resources department, and human resources managers, would like to tap into the latest IO psychology literature, but when they go and read the literature, sometimes they can find it difficult. They can find it jargony or overly technical, or in some cases just like, hey, this is impractical, or this is just completely irrelevant to our world. So some of the challenges. And then a big challenge is businesses operate on their own time schedule. And often that time schedule is acute and painful because a new competitor came in and is stealing all our best people, and who's left are not motivated, and our productivity is going down. And hey, we just hired you, expensive IO psychology consulting company, fix this, make our people motivated. Sometimes science doesn't act at the speed that business needs, and so you've got a mismatch there. So all of these are just the general challenges. This isn't meant to be some sort of pessimistic thing. This is just challenges are where people challenges often where satisfaction comes from. People like to have a rawhide chew to chew on. If you understand what I mean. If you have a dog, but I wanted to give you a flavor of what the landscape is. Okay, so we'll finish up lecture 1 by talking a little bit more broadly of like, why is it that you should be a student of psychology in the workplace? I mean, why should you, as someone who is already or is going to be a long-term member of a place called work, why should you be a student of psychology? And this is much broader than IO psychology. IO psychology, the stuff we're going to talk about, performance management, leadership development, organizational development, all that is good stuff. And you'll understand in the workplace like why that matters. But this is broader. Why does the rest of psychology, most of the rest of psychology, also matter? And so I want to talk about that for just a few minutes for our last part of this lecture. So, one of the things that we all carry around with us is a sort of a model of how humans operate, and whether that model is explicit or not, it depends. And we also have these little mini models of various people we know, and we call those things like personalities. And those are running models of how you sort of expect people to behave based on their track record. And when they suddenly behave differently, when somebody who's super introverted is all of a sudden super assertive, it's like, whoa, something's different. And that's because there was a mismatch between your model and what you're expecting people to do and what you actually observe. So everybody has models for human behavior, but this is about developing a more nuanced, more explicit model for human behavior that can be very helpful. And I would encourage you to be a lifelong student of human behavior, and to look to psychology in a open-minded, but somewhat skeptical view when you're seeing new stuff, because a lot of times the new stuff doesn't quite pan out. But having a detailed framework for understanding people can be very helpful. It helps you understand why people do what they do. And now I want to back up a little bit here with a word of caution on models is in hubris. And definitely within psychology, there's been a past that's been hubristic about its mental models. People are complicated, like ridiculously complicated. The reason why you can't create a model that will actually tell you exactly how somebody will behave isn't because psychology somehow isn't a real domain, and it isn't because it's not scientific. It's because it's so complicated. In a physics experiment or a chemistry experiment, you can control the conditions a little bit better, or a lot better, and you can do things that are quite repeatably, even mathematically repeatable. But psychology has so much going on. There's so many variables at play that these models, and I'm talking about the benefits of developing a mature, nuanced model for human behavior. These models should not be looked at like they're going to tell you what's going to happen, like you can just count on them, and that if they don't happen according to your model, then somebody wasn't behaving right, or that sort of thing. So again, Google. You can look back at lots of things in the history of psychology where models, psychoanalytic models, and other things, where people who deviated from those models were actually deemed to have something wrong with them, when in fact it was the models that were cartoonish in terms of their dimensionality. And so you have to view these models as imperfect, and you have to view these models as sort of helpful to give you a framework of understanding, to help you sort of look at a situation that's unfolding or that just happened, and give you some insight into what may have been some of the factors, what might be some of the psychological factors that'll help diffuse the situation. But don't look at it like you've got this figured out. Psychology can be intoxicating because it gives you an explanatory framework. Really, and the reason why they can be sort of intoxicating is because explanatory frameworks reduce uncertainty, and uncertainty is a thing that we're all programmed to be stressed about. And uncertainty in human interactions can be very frightening. And when you have a model that takes that uncertainty away, it can be quite calming, and very attractive. So be careful with psychological models, and don't embrace them too tightly, and always view them as flawed. But at the same time, if you have that perspective that they're not consistently predictive, and that humans will always surprise you, having a good model can still be extremely useful to navigating circumstances and not getting interpersonally upset about stuff, and helping diffuse situations, because you can think of the other contributing factors that might have been at play. So that helps you navigate social situations, helps you avoid misunderstandings and pitfalls, and all of these things grow your management skills. Make you a better leader, whether that's a formal leader or just what's called influencing without authority, understanding people better, and just having an objective model with which you can ascribe behavior to. Again, not too tightly, and not too hubristically or arrogantly, but recognizing that there's other factors than what are in your model, but that your model does give you some insight on some. It's just really valuable. And that helps you make the most of difference. So you see difference in people more positively if you have the right model. You don't have sort of a one-size-fits-all, and you don't get too bent out of shape if somebody didn't behave the way you thought they were supposed to behave. I mean, as an autistic person, I could talk about this in a great deal. and I work with lots and lots of engineers that have, shall we say, underdeveloped social skills as well. And when you're looking at would somebody make a good leader, you can't just look at sort of external charisma trappings. You know, do they walk the walk and talk? Do they look like a good leader? Do they sound like a good leader? You need to get past that, and recognizing the differences in people. And same thing with, you know, just teaming, and not just whether they're a leader, but whether they're a team member. So anyway, let's get going and finish this up. So all of those things can help you improve team performance. A better understanding of people helps you with stress, and that affects your health, and that can help you become more resilient and avoid burnout. And then understanding, you know, motivation and understanding mindset, that can help you optimize performance and development. Okay, we are done with lecture 1. Let's do a quick recap. I like to preview what we're going to talk about, and I like to recap what we're going to talk about, and then the next lecture we'll recap what we talked about today. Just, you know, like, it's good to have those little touch points of reminders. It's kind of like reading your note cards, so to speak. So let's get going. We did a course overview here today, and that included introducing myself, and then we went through the lectures that we're going to cover in this course and the sequence. The actual schedule is in the syllabus, and again, please read the syllabus for not just the schedule but also for policies. And then we got into chapter 1, and we did an overview of what IO psychology was. We talked about careers, and then in a couple different dimensions, we looked at challenges in the industry, and then we just finished talking about why you should be a student of psychology throughout your career at wherever it is that you call work. And the next lecture, we are going to stay on chapter 1, but we're going to look at the history of IO psychology. And that includes the early 20th century, a focus on things called scientific management and efficiency. In World War I, where assessment techniques were developed for figuring out where recruits should go. And then the Hawthorne studies and the famous Hawthorne effect. And then World War II, and one of the big impacts of World War II was the emergence of engineering psychology. And then post-war, all of the boom years and the cultural change and the dawn of the digital, and then the continued accelerating change of what we've got around us. And we'll look at how IO psychology has developed along that timeline, and hopefully give a good perspective to get into the real meat of IO psychology for the following lectures. So thank you very much for your time. I hope this was interesting. I look forward to talking to you throughout the semester. So we'll see you at lecture 2.